So, what's so illegal about illegal immigration? What makes it illegal? We'll talk about what that is and what it should be today on the Gary DeMar Show. Hello, and thank you for joining me on the Gary DeMar Show once again today. I'm Joel McDurmon. Rounding out this three-part discussion, which is all too brief, on a biblical view of illegal immigration. Certainly haven't said all that could be said, probably need to nuance some of the things I did say. Today I want to try to get to the heart of the matter. What makes illegal immigration illegal? Well, in our nation today, it is the fact that you don't have documented papers to prove that you're a citizen. And there's a whole mechanism for enforcing the borders. There are federal checkpoints, all this kind of stuff for entering the nation. None of that derives from biblical law. In fact, it stands, I would say, in opposition to it. Israel was not like the nations around her. Yes, there were commandments in the law that made distinctions, as I've said in the past few days, between a resident alien and a non-resident alien, and the law applied to them differently. The resident alien was afforded the protections of civil law that the citizen or native-born citizen would have gotten. That does not mean the state had the right to identify you, to license you in any way, to make you show them your papers. The state's job in Israel simply was to enforce contracts, to protect the sanctity of private property, and to, in matters, carry out civil punishments. We can get into a whole discussion of whether that requires papers and stuff. I don't think it does. What the issue of immigration in biblical times was over private property rights. And the person who got to decide whether a person became a resident alien or not was not the state, it was the property owner. And the property owner had to work out how this person would be taken care of, whether they would be an employee, whether they would generate their own income, et cetera, or whether they would become a beneficiary, not of the state, but of the private property owner. That was up to him, and the state's job would have simply been to enforce his rights in owning the property. If someone crossed into the borders and was unwelcome, the state's job was not to license that person or not license that person. The state's job was to protect the private property owner's rights, and would have, in that case, led to the deportation of that person. So Israel was not like the other nations we've seen, in particular Egypt or Edom, where we see the principle of private property rights in action, not because the state in those cases protected it. They probably didn't to some degree, but because the Israelites were so keen on that principle themselves, and so they went directly to the king, who in those nations was really considered the main property owner, and asked his permission to come through the land. And that if they ate or drank anything along the way, in the case of Edom, they would pay for it. Okay, this was not because those nations are an example of how we should take care of immigration today. It's an example of how private property was at the core of the Israelite way of life. And of course, it was built into the law. What makes illegal immigration illegal? As I said today, it's the state's decision. In biblical times, it should have been the property owner's decision. The reason it's such a problem is because the state, who should be keen on protecting private property, has today become the biggest enemy of private property. It wants to play the role of God. It wants to play the role of provider. And so it has created these great social welfare schemes which make it profitable for immigrants and illegal aliens to come over, so that in different ways, shapes, and forms, they can benefit from those plans. And of course, the liberals love this, and the Christian socialists love this, because that means more votes for liberals, and they want power, and they want the state to be God, and they want to use the Bible to justify that position without having to say it. So they go to these verses about the sojourners and being treated equally, and they refuse to make distinctions between, number one, private property rights and the state's limitations in the Bible, and social welfare programs and things like that, as well as the distinctions between resident aliens and non-resident aliens. I recommended this book, The Immigration Crisis, by James Hoffmeyer, in both the past two shows, but I did say there are things in here that I disagree with. One of them is the way he treats Old Testament law. He goes through it very clearly. He makes lots of good points. It's the best part of the meat of the book. But when it gets to the end, he takes the laws of gleaning, which say that the resident alien had the same rights to those charitable laws for the poor and the alien, which were the social benefits of the time, in biblical law. And he abstracts from that and says, therefore, aliens, resident aliens in our time should have the same access to social benefits. Well, the difference is those were biblical social benefits, and what we have today are squarely anti-biblical social benefits, where the state appropriates the property and distributes it by force. And that, of course, creates the incentive for the immigrants to come over and partake of those things. And then that gets into the whole issue of the state gets to determine who gets it. So the state becomes an enemy of private property by doing this, and in abstracting those laws from the Old Testament, Hoffmeyer's position really is no different in the long run than that of the Christian socialists, some of whom he tries to answer in this book. That's the problem, is the social welfare programs. That's the problem, is the state playing God and provider. That's the problem with illegal immigration. If we got rid of that and the state reverted back simply to protecting private property, we would have a whole different scenario, and we would have a whole freer scenario. And of course, there would be issues of mass migrations, maybe, I don't know, over time. But if we had a different view of private property ourselves and legacy and children, that really wouldn't be an issue. But that's a whole different discussion. So what makes illegal immigration illegal? Well, it's because the state is in an improper role. The state is too big and too powerful, and it's taken over the situation. Unless we reform the welfare benefits, it's pretty much useless to talk about the issue of immigration from a biblical standpoint, because you really haven't touched the heart of the matter. So while I appreciate this book, I think it has a serious flaw, and that's it. So there's a lot more to be said on this subject. Maybe we'll get to it in some articles or something, but that's it for now, and I appreciate you joining me and listening to me on this topic. Thank you.
For more related to this topic, check out God versus Socialism, a biblical critique of the New Social Gospel. You will find it at AmericanVision.com.